Now let's talk about scope. There are two aspects to scope. Scope is what the product does, the features and the functionality of the product. It is also what the people need to do to get the product to do what it's supposed to do. Another way to think about it is that scope is what the product does and the work that is needed to make the product. Of course, this also applies to a service or a result. So, all the work that is needed to build the product is also the scope. That is an important point. We often think of scope purely in terms of the product, but we want to expand that view of scope to include work. Scope is predicated on requirements. Remember, scope is what the people do and what the product does. So how do we describe what the product does? That can be captured in many ways. One of the ways to think about it is that requirements capture what the product does. So how do we gather requirements? Again, there are many ways to do that. We can document them in plain English. Sometimes it can be a more structured way of documenting them. Sometimes it can be pictures and diagrams or very technical type of language used. We're not going to get into all of that. The important thing to keep in mind about requirements gathering is that it is an effort that involves interaction with various stakeholders. So you need a lot of communication and perhaps negotiation with stakeholders to find out what it is that you're trying to accomplish with the project. When we talk requirements, what we are really talking about are the requirements as they pertain to the functionality, the features, the capabilities of the product, service, or result coming out of the project. We said at the beginning that work and what the product does are really the two components of scope. Scope is associated with what the product does and what work the people need to do. The next step then, once we have requirements, which captures what the product does, is how do we get to work? That's what the remainder of the scope column, as you see it in the framework, is associated with, moving from requirements to work. You can think of requirements as being numerous. There could be 500 requirements associated with a project. However, when you want to move toward work, you have to consolidate those requirements in some way. For example, let's say you want to build a plane and you have 500 requirements. You might say, how do these requirements impact the cockpit, the cargo, the wings, the cabin, and so on? You may associate those requirements with various components of the plane. However, that's not the only way to bucket the various requirements. There are many other ways you could do it. You could classify the requirements by organizations. You could classify them by functionality, like avionics, mechanics, hydraulics, electronics, and so on. But let's make believe that we are going to classify these requirements on a component basis. Let's take some of them and see how they impact the cockpit and the other components like cabin, wings, cargo, and so on. When you go from requirements to a more well-rounded view of how those requirements impact the components, that is the define scope process that you see in the framework. Defining scope is really trying to put some shape and define deliverables around those requirements and saying how they pertain to the components, the organizations, or the functionality of this plane.